And so everyone, welcome to the Let's Talk Privacy and Technology series, where we talk about privacy design, privacy engineering, data ethics, and more. As you know, I'm Lourdes Turrecha, your host, the Privacy Tech and Law Fellow at Santa Clara Law, and also an adjunct professor there. In previous lives, I've been a privacy and cybersecurity practitioner in Big Law and Fortune 300, and most recently in Silicon Valley. I'm now working and writing about the rise of privacy technologies. And as you've noticed, we've had 3 privacy tech founders in a previous episode. So I'm really excited that we're pivoting today and talking to Professor Woodrow Hartzog, who is the professor of law and computer sciences at Northeastern University and the author of Privacy's Blueprint, The Battle to Control the Design of New Technologies. He's going to share with us some of his journey into privacy and technology academia and talk a little bit about privacy design. Hello, Professor Hartzog, and welcome to the series.
Hi, how are you? It's good to see you. Thanks for having me on.
Of course, and thank you for joining us today. You and I have had a chat previously about, about your journey into privacy academia, but I'd love for you to share with our audience how you ended up in privacy academia, particularly in the intersection of privacy and technology. You're one of the leading commenters out there when it comes to privacy design and the issues that we have with new technologies and particularly privacy and cybersecurity issues in the intersection of technology.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about this. The professors love to talk about themselves, so this is just an invitation. So it all started back when, let me take you back to the days of dial-up internet. And I was an undergraduate, and I was taking a media law course, and we got to the end of the course, and we had covered the law of magazines and the law of radio and the law of television. And I raised my hand and I said, what about the law of the internet? We haven't covered that yet. And my professor at the time said, well, that nobody knows what the law of the internet is going to be. And it blew my mind. Like it must have knocked something loose in my head. And I said, wait, nobody knows what the law is? Because I thought that the law was the kind of thing where when you studied it, you would sit down and the professor would tell you what the law was, and then you would memorize it, and then you did law, right? And that was my understanding of what law was at the time. And so it inspired me to go to law school. And at law school, I was literally in the law school on the morning of September the 11th. And everything that came after that had a profound effect on me in terms of thinking about how the law is used by those in power to effectuate certain ends. And it really sort of became abundantly clear how I began to be very disturbed about some of the provisions in the USA Patriot Act with respect to expanding surveillance. And I began to study that very deeply. And I remember I had when I was getting my LLM, I had Dan Soloff as my privacy professor. And I remember sitting down with Dan and I said, Professor, I want to be a privacy attorney. And this was 2003, I think. And he said, that's not a thing. He said, that's not a thing that people do. It's not a established career. Not like at the time, there were relatively established careers for people in intellectual property, particularly if you did patents. But at the time, it wasn't really clear that you could actually make a whole career out of being a privacy attorney. So I said, okay, well, I guess I'll do other things like intellectual property and things like that. But I continued to be very interested in what was happening in privacy, and it compelled me to write. Even when I was an attorney, I was writing a lot about surveillance law. I was writing a lot about technology law. And then my sister in 2005 pulled up something, I can't remember, I think it was maybe on her laptop at the time. I don't think it was yet mobile. She said, this is called the Facebook. And I said, what? And again, I could feel my brain like do the thing where it contorted and it said, this is going to change everything. And maybe not necessarily in a good way. And so I began to dive in a little more deeply, and that's when I decided I was going to focus all of my efforts on researching and writing about privacy law, because it occurred to me that even when I had sort of free time, I was thinking about privacy and reading books about privacy. And so I was like, well, if this is just going to dominate my life, I might as well dedicate my career to it. And so that's how I came to it, is through one sort of mind-bending experience after another. Interspersed with me writing in my college newspaper about how everyone should download Napster immediately because they never have to pay for music again. And getting a very kind email from the local law students that said, you know, you're violating copyright law, advocating mass copyright infringement, right? And I said, I was an undergraduate at the time. I said, what's copyright law? So new technologies, as they begin to change things, I find endlessly fascinating. So that's how I wound up where I am.
I think that based on your responses, there are a couple of things I want to highlight. First, I mean, our common, I think there's like a common thread there. We kind of rose up under Professor Solov. He has been a huge inspiration to me and a big figure in my career as well. And the second one is how much passion and enthusiasm and excitement I can hear in your voice when you talk about your quest for a career in privacy law. And when I was in law school, there were already careers in privacy, but it was still harder to get into it at that time. Certainly not as hard as when you were in law school, where it wasn't even an established career yet. Given the enthusiasm, I wanted to, maybe this is a good time for us to talk about what makes you excited about privacy and technology. And you have been one of the top thinkers and commenters on issues intersecting privacy and technology. Your take on COVID-19 tracking technologies and facial recognition. What do you find so fascinating about it? And maybe walk us through, you know, here's an issue, a new technology out in media that everyone's talking about. What about it is fascinating to you that makes you compelled to address it or write about it?
So that's a great question. I think that the thing that keeps me so fascinated about privacy probably stems from Dan Solov's influence, and a lot of it was many of us, when we first come to privacy, have maybe a particular idea about what privacy actually is, right? And I'll never forget when my son, who when he was 3 years old, one day had overheard enough conversations, and he said, "Dad, what's privacy?" And I welled up with pride, and I was ready for this moment, and I said, "Oh boy, here it comes. I get to explain my life's work to my son." I said, "Son, privacy is a very complicated concept with many different nuanced interpretations." He was 3. He like turned his head to the side, and I was like, "Well, many people conceive of privacy as, you know, perhaps freedom from surveillance," or he turned his head again. And I thought about it for a second. I said, "Son, privacy is when you close the door when you go to the bathroom." And like that resonated, right? He was like, "I get it now," right? Privacy is secrecy, privacy. And many of us come to privacy with a sort of similar idea, right? That privacy is about freedom. We don't, nobody wants to be spied on. Everyone can sort of uniformly relate to that. But Dan's work in particular, but many people that were thinking about privacy at the time I started reading about it, we're starting to push on the boundaries of that. And so, privacy is actually it's a lot of different things. It can be thought of as control over personal information, or secrecy, or intimacy, or Helen Nissenbaum comes out with a theory about contextual integrity. And it occurred to me that privacy was much more expansive and actually much more important than many people had originally thought about it. And so now I spend a lot of my career thinking about privacy in terms of obscurity, which is what Evan Tellinger and I have been writing about for quite some time, or privacy as trust, which is what Neil Richards and I have been writing about for quite some time. And And the thing that's exciting to me is that when you conceive of privacy, and in particular, a lot of what I've been writing about is data. The sort of two prongs, right? There's surveillance, and then there's data, and it's a lot of overlapping. But when you think about data, the creation of data, the use of data, I think of as a moral act. And by that, I mean, it has these sort of implications for people's well-beings. And every new technology that comes out requires us to make an assessment about the ethics of particular design decisions or processing choices. I remember loving property law when I took it because it had these really important questions, but I also remember thinking about property law, but it doesn't change that much, right? So we have questions about easements, and adverse possession hasn't changed a ton since the beginning of time, and but with privacy law, every single thing that happens almost requires us to re-interrogate it anew, right? So the COVID apps are a really great point of analysis where we have to start asking, okay, we know immediately that there are a sort of set of privacy questions that we have about these apps. But the more interesting thing in my mind are the bigger questions about these apps. So can they work in isolation, or do we have to solve bigger contextual problems in order for them to ever even stand a fighting chance, for one, right? What are the lasting norms that will be created by these apps? What sort of inertia are we building into the system by embracing technological solutions to complex social problems? And so a lot of what I find so interesting about privacy is actually how it relates to these larger systems, and how sometimes I think people are trying to solve really complex, messy problems with simple technological solutions. And maybe that's not the best way, and maybe it is. But that's what I love. I like to think about how these new systems sort of work within our world, rather than asking more narrow questions about, is this data portable? Should we delete it? Things like that. All of which is fascinating, but it's the bigger questions that sort of keep me up at night, in a good and bad way.
I mean, I love it. There's so many ways that we can go from there, but I wanted to just take some time to concur with you about the effect that Dan's work, particularly understanding privacy and his taxonomy of privacy, has had on me. I love the conversation that you had with your son. And it's true for most people, not just with children, but folks who aren't in privacy. Privacy is this secrecy thing only for them, with the control over their data or their individual decisions, without really looking into the other aspects of it that Dan and you and other academics have worked on in the past years. So I want to take some time to talk about the future of privacy and technologies, and how you feel and what are some of your predictions about them. And you've caught some media attention about your suggestion and your takes on AI and facial recognition in particular. So I want to take this opportunity to address that here.
Sure. So I mean, I'm happy to talk about. So would you like me to address how I think it's going to go, or how I think it should go?
Let's do both. Let's do where you think it should go. But given what you know about the world, it's probably gonna go somewhere else, right? we don't always get what we want.
I remain optimistic, but also not ignorant of the trajectories of a lot of these things based on the past. So let me take two things specifically. The first is, let's take two concrete issues and talk about them. The first is the future of regulating surveillance, particularly facial recognition technology. So we've seen a lot of interesting things here, and even in the past 6 months, that have been fascinating. So Evan Selinger and I wrote an article on Medium over a while back, where we came right out and called for an outright ban on facial recognition technologies. And we floated this at a couple of conferences. I floated the idea when I was giving a book talk, actually, right around the time I was giving book talks. I one time was accused of having too reasonable prescriptive solutions in the book talk, and they said, what's something radical? And I said, well, something radical is we should ban facial recognition outright. Pull it out, root and stem. And the reason why is because I think that I can't conceive of any future where we, as a society, come out ahead using facial recognition technology. There are, of course, potential benefits in that there are of all sorts of digital technologies, but given the capacity for abuse, both of what we already know about how it's being abused and the fact that once it's entrenched, that abuse will be magnified and it's almost inevitable, and the weakness of the regulatory proposals that we've seen that are being proposed, there's just no way that we come out ahead in my mind. And so when Evan and I proposed this, we got a fair amount of pushback, and of course continue to have a fair amount of pushback. But at the time, one of the main pieces of critique is that they say, well, it'll never happen, that no government will ever outright ban a technology. That's just not what we do, right? And one of the standard lines that I heard was, we don't just ban technologies. You regulate them, right? You facilitate them in. But one of the problems that Evan and I had is that sort of thinking bakes in a value-based assumption that, or normative assumption that all technologies are worth creating, right? That any sort of technology, like by default, if it's a new technology, it's good. We should figure out a way to regulate it and implement it in society. And I think that we've sort of had a little myopia about, or maybe a lack of imagination about the full scale of the kinds of rules that we could envision, right? Almost always. And this leads me to my next sort of prediction, which is that our playbook for so long has been procedural in nature, right? That we if you want to do something, we have to get people's consent, or you have to do a data protection impact assessment, or you have to do some sort of procedure that essentially lays the justification for these technologies. And what Evan and I, and there's some other scholars that are pushing back on this as well. Frank Pasquale's got a whole book coming out about it soon. What we're hoping to push back on is that the idea that, well, maybe some of these technologies simply shouldn't exist in the first place, right? That maybe some technologies are so inherently destructive by their very design that we should not allow them, because technology is not an inevitability, right? People create technologies, and we also create the rules that can limit them. And so at least particular technologies are not an inevitability. And so we can guide them in that way. And so one of the things that I've been also wanting to see, if I were picking the future, is a vision of data privacy law that goes beyond merely the fair information practices, which is, of course, the groundwork for all sorts of regulatory regimes around the world, including the GDPR and the CCPA. And of course, data protection is important. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And one of the things I would like to see is a more holistic view of data privacy that involves relationships, which would include a lot of what I've written about with Neil Richards about the importance of trust-based laws. Ari Waldman and Jack Balkin and Jonathan Zittrain have also explored this idea. Professor Balkin and Zittrain have written about information fiduciaries, and Ari has also written about trust, Professor Waldman. And so I think that if you take relationships, if you take corporate matters, the GDPR does this a little bit, where you could think about a future that also regulates corporate structure as a way of creating incentives to engage in privacy protective behaviors. We could think about, of course, part of this is antitrust law and competition law, which I think has a large and underdeveloped role to play in privacy law. thinking about executive accountability, which has been proposed as a basis of some of the recent proposals, and then also the externalities of the personal data industrial complex. So the thing that I've been worried about recently is the insatiable desire for data has led to a number of negative externalities, including a corrosion and depletion of our attention spans, their efforts, erosion of our public institutions, and even environmental concerns, all of which is not necessarily part of privacy, but the hunger for data feeds these problems, right, or leads to these problems. And so it certainly isn't unrelated to privacy and data concerns. And so I would like to see a little bit more holistic view of privacy, of data privacy, rather than one that is sort of more narrowly focused on classical FIPS-based data protection rules. That's what I want to see happen. What is going to happen? It's unclear. I've actually been quite inspired and excited by the level of activity at the local level within cities to put moratoriums and bans on facial recognition technologies. States, of course, have an important role to play. I'm maybe less optimistic about the trajectory of U.S. data privacy law because we're not going to get any federal legislation anytime soon. And so it looks like California is going to be leading the way with the CCPA, which has its virtues, but it's still heavily based in sort of FIPS-style data protection regimes, which I think is also built around a concept of privacy as control over information, which also has its virtues, but I think is impossible at scale. And so we're getting into some interesting territory now in the development of data privacy law in the United States. It's also, of course, being influenced by the GDPR because Europe was first to the punch in terms of a robust omnibus regulatory regime, and that's affecting regimes around the world and how they create and interpret their rules. So we'll see.
I agree 100%. Especially with your point on how weak our regulatory proposals has been when it comes to privacy, how it's been largely procedural. I love the point about ethics, and we've certainly seen the backlash or techlash against big tech and how they have failed to design their technologies in an ethical way. I love your point about trust, and I'm looking forward to reading your paper on privacy as trust. That's one of the topics that I've been interested in for the past few years. So I think it's a good time to pivot and talk about one of the explainers that we do usually in this series. We pick up a theme and talk about it in depth, and you and I discuss about how we could do that for privacy design, and particularly privacy loss design gap, and where you talk about this in your book, and I love that book, by the way, so I recommend it to everyone who's listening in. I am recommending it to my students in the spring, and it's a good way to think about privacy beyond procedures, right? Beyond the DPIAs and consent and notices. What do you think? To me, I'll probably have follow-ups, but let's start with, what do you think are the procedural weaknesses of privacy laws in general? Where do they fail when it comes to design?
Sure. So thank you very much. I appreciate the kind words. So I tell, when I give my book talk, I say, I teach privacy law and it's a semester-long course and we get into it. I was like, but actually, I could save you all a lot of trouble. If you're interested, there's actually only basically 3 privacy laws. There are 3 major rules in privacy. And if you got those, then you basically got the whole thing. And the first is do not lie, right? This is basically the Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, prohibition on deceptive trade practices. But it also has given birth to the sort of predominant regulatory regime in the United States, which is, we're not going to tell you what to put in your privacy policy, but whatever it is that you say you're going to do, you have to do it. But of course, there's a major design gap in all three of these rules. And starting with do not lie, you can put substantive truth almost anywhere you want, because these companies that create our mediated environments have total control over what we see and what we're able to click. And so you can be truthful in a lot of different places. And I ask the question, I say, if you were forced to disclose the location of a dead body somewhere, in a way that is accessible to theoretically the whole world, where would you put it? And the answer, of course, is in the terms of use, because no one reads them and no one should be allowed, no one should be expected to read them, right? It's madness to think that we would actually spend tons of time for every single website that we would go to reading the terms of use, even if they were simply drafted, right? Because we simply visit too many websites. And so there's a design gap there. Design can be used, and Ari Waldman has also talked about this in some of his research. Design can be used to basically make technical truth meaningless, right? Either by illegitimate or overpowering our resources. So there's a massive design gap there. The second rule, the second design rule is do not harm, or the second rule of privacy law is do not harm. And this is, of course, tracking onto the Federal Trade Commission's prohibition on unfair trade practices. And the problem with the do not harm mentality, which also tracks onto the privacy, the general approach of using tort law to solve privacy problems, is that the modern privacy predicament is not one where injuries are rare and highly significant and concrete. Right? Occasionally it does happen as such, and maybe this is where tort law and unfairness comes in. But that's not how our privacy gets eroded by modern technology companies. It's more like the death by 1,000 cuts, right? One cut at a time, and no one singular cut is enough to rise to the challenge of giving rise to some sort of cognizable claim, either by the government or by a private party, to bring in a way that's actually going to deter that behavior in the future. And so the design of these systems is such that it extracts just a little bit from us each incremental bit at a time, right? And so but in that way, the design of these tools is working against us, and the law doesn't combat that. And then the final rule, the final sort of rule, at least in U.S. data privacy law, is follow the fair information practices. And for those that aren't familiar with the fair information practices, they're the basic set of rules that I assume most people reading are, if not, that were created many years ago to basically allow for the safe and sustainable and fair processing of personal data. And I wrote an article a few years ago called The Inadequate, Invaluable Fair Information Practices. And again, they are necessary but not sufficient to protect our privacy, because a lot of times the way that the fair information practices, which are things like you have to be transparent, you have to have accountability, you have to protect information, you have to provide, they have to be accurate, right? There has to be rights of deletion and opt-out, and all of these sort of things almost always comes down, at least within the U.S. experience, to this idea of privacy as control over information, which ultimately sort of comes down to notice and choice. And if you ask the tech companies, they'll say, they'll be asked, do you protect privacy? And every tech company CEO will say, yes, we do. We give our users maximum choice over information sharing, right? We want to give you control over your personal information. Twitter did it to me this week, where they, flash up some pop-up. They're like, now you have more control than ever over your privacy, which sounds great. Who doesn't want more control over their personal information? Sounds like a great idea. Sign me up. Except how control is effectuated in mediated environments is not some sort of open-ended say whatever you want and we'll do it, right? So Facebook was some sort of genie that would grant whatever control we ask of them. It gets effectuated as a button, right? A toggle button, which you're probably familiar with, on, off, right, on your phone. And so already our entire universe of choices has been dwindled down to one binary choice, right? On or off. Do you want privacy? Do you not? Okay, yes, I do. I don't know, I don't. And then sometimes things are expanded where we have they say, well, we give you more options, right? We throw a different set of tools at you. And that's all great and good, except the problem with that is it taxes more from you, right? So you have to, instead of giving one toggle button, you're given 10 toggle buttons, right? You're like, oh man, now I've got to look at these 10 toggle buttons, right? The design of these information technologies are used to put so much burden on us that we get overwhelmed, right? Because then you let's say you spend time, you think about all 10 toggle buttons, that's just for one app, right? Now you've got how many apps on your phone? 50, right? You better look at them, and they're going to change, by the way, because these things are getting updated all the time. And so the problem of thinking about privacy as control over information is that if we get our wish for more privacy, we're given so much control that we choke on it, right? Our facilities shut down and we're unable to exercise any meaningful sense of agency. And design is leveraged in that way, right? So that companies can get what they want because, again, they're choosing what we get to what we get to fiddle with. And they almost always will get it, right? Because they can engineer these environments. And so privacy law has really yet to come to grips with the way in which the design of these technologies are being used to circumvent the ultimate goals of privacy law, which, by the way, I think are impossible in the long run anyway, at least if we're talking about control. The kind of control that's being promised to us by lawmakers, by industry, is probably impossible, at least in mediated environments.
Design decisions certainly factor into how we are able to exercise their control. And I've seen that a lot of times, right? We might have those toggle buttons and dozens of them from one platform alone, but the decisions that these tech companies make in offering us those choices and this illusory control over our data were already pre-made when they made those decisions from the design stage. I love your description of, privacy and death by 1,000 cuts. I mean, it's very illustrative of big data and all the online services that we use today and mass surveillance. Given all of that, what do you think is the biggest privacy and technology challenge or issue that we face today?
I think the biggest thing that we're dealing with right now has to be a general assumption about the inevitability of technologies, right? So the idea that, and a sort of lack of recognition about the mere creation of data as having ethical implications, right? And then when we fail to do that, we fail to then see how these tools are being used in ways that are incredibly corrosive to our public institutions. They can be incredibly harmful to people of color and other vulnerable populations. There are all sorts of things that flow from that. And instead, it causes us to have a very relatively narrow view, I think, of what the solutions are. And so I think that in order for us to have a better approach to privacy generally, we have to step outside this sort of individualistic, process-based notion of privacy as I get to choose what is best for me and my data, and if a billion people all get to make that decision, then privacy is respected, right? And that sort of individualistic thinking is sort of what got us into this mess, because it created frameworks that allowed a lot of opportunistic behavior to flourish among tech companies because it focuses on the individual rather than a lot of other goals. So, and then the other big one, I think, is in our discourse, there's also a strong reluctance, and maybe this is just a holdover from the sort of golden days of Silicon Valley, but there's a lot of reluctance to embrace solutions that will cost a lot of money to companies, right? So it's hard for companies to justify leaving money on the table. And so I hear a lot of discussions about how we can, we can still do this and it'll still protect innovation. And until I hear a company sort of come out and say, we're going to do the following, 5 steps, and it's going to cost us billions of dollars, then maybe it's an open question as to how serious you really are about meaningful privacy reform, because sometimes it is going to cost that. In order to change, I think, these big systemic changes, we can make a lot of tweaks at the margins, which could be useful. But if we really want meaningful systemic change, we've got to think about different business models. So maybe that's a really long-winded way of saying the biggest problems that we face are business models.
Fair enough. I think that's right. I was just talking to a privacy tech founder who came out with, I believe it was our episode 1. He came out to talk about building a privacy first company and how difficult that was. Certainly I could see it costing more mature companies, big tech companies, millions and billions of dollars to correct things. But for a startup, there are some things that they can do right from the beginning. And so maybe what are some of the advice that you, as a privacy expert, someone who's been thinking about these things, what are some of the advice that you can share with these young entrepreneurs who are recognizing the privacy problems that we have today and coming up and thinking, hey, we want to help address this? Do you have any for them?
Sure. I mean, I guess the biggest piece of advice is think about how this is going to scale, and think about different ways of approaching staying financially solvent and profitable without following the standard sort of, let's invent something cool and awesome, and we'll get a lot of data, and then we can sell the data and keep doing something cool and awesome, right? Which has, again, virtues, but has led us down this path where I believe we've really struggled to sort of move beyond other ways to fund business, other ways to fund things that society needs, right? And so to think about other kinds of models where you might not have the incentive, particularly as you scale, particularly as you go public, and you have to justify regularly quarterly earnings, where you say, well, how do we maintain more profit? Well, we harvest people's attention more, right? Because we got to get that data, because we have to then sort of optimize, right? And to think about a system that isn't dependent upon the harvesting of attention because of the data that it yields or the efficiencies that it yields. And so the day will come, if your product is, if your company is successful, that you will need to be able to scale it, and to encourage just thinking beyond that, the path that we've seen thus far as the dominant path.
And it's hard for these young entrepreneurs to think the long game, because our market has had, if you look at the market, we've repaid the biggest privacy abusers of our time. And so as one of a colleague, Davy Ottenheimer, commented, one of the things that these founders who are passionate about privacy, about helping solve some of these privacy problems, one of the things that they have to keep in mind is that you are going to go up against non-privacy first companies. And so it's really, and it might be hard to think the long game, but the good thing that I've noticed anyway is that we as consumers have started developing different privacy sentiment in favor of privacy and started making choices. And that to me is particularly encouraging. And I'm hoping that because of that, because of regulatory changes, the changing consumer sentiment, and these entrepreneurs who are increasingly becoming interested in privacy problems, I'm hoping that we get better privacy alternatives to the creepy ones that we have today. Um, so speaking of advice, we do have some law students and privacy law students in the audience. What are some of the advice that you want to impart to them as a practitioner? I've shared mine in the past. I've asked you about this question and Dan about this question as well. And I'm sure they would appreciate your take on some of the things that you found helpful as you navigated your way into privacy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So the first question is, I do think that it's important to have a clear sense of why you want to do this kind of work, right? So it's easy to be attracted to the privacy and technology field because there's so much exciting things that are happening. There's so many exciting things that are happening. It's changing all the time. It's dynamic. But one of the things that I think is important is to ask yourself, what specifically are you drawn to, right? Like if someone to ask you, if I were to ask, you or someone else the same question you asked me, which is what's the most pressing problem right now, at least have a sense of what that is, right? Because that will help you not only, I think, stay centered as you become a practitioner, but it will also help you, practically speaking, when you're talking with other people, because the next thing that I would recommend is talk to as many people as you possibly can, because this is at least my experience has been that this is a relatively open and welcoming community, at least as compared to other sorts of legal and compliance-based communities. And so that if you have a question, reach out, because people are kind and people are helpful and also love talking about the same things that you love talking about. So, and not only is it a way to sort of help get a foothold into a new career, but it's a way to potentially find your people if this is a calling to you. And then the third thing is read everything you can get your hands on. That seems obvious, but it was the thing that really made a difference to me when I started getting into this, is trying to grab everything and don't just read what is relevant from the latest newsletter or whatever, which is all important and good, but think about reading books from adjacent areas, right? Books from philosophy, books from STS studies. Privacy is not just about regulatory compliance. It's about how power is gained and how power is used and how power is used against people, right? So read books by people of color who are writing in this area to give you a different shade of what's happening, right? That there are so many different disciplines that have something unique to contribute to this concept that is foundational to human flourishing beyond just the law. And I think that will make you a fuller, richer privacy professional as you go out as a privacy attorney working in this area, because you're able to bring that host of wisdom from other areas, not just the law. Although I write in the law, so I think the law is also important, but the law is a tool just like a lot of things are. So there's a lot more to it than that.
Indeed, and it's a very cross-functional area. It's not just about the law, so I do appreciate your advice to read and explore and reach out and connect to other people in adjacent areas, and not just because they're all relevant in this cross-functional field, but also it's all about relationships too, and finding your people, as you put it. I want to end us with a question that I usually ask most guests, and it's a cheeky one. What privacy feature or technology do you wish existed? Like, if you could just snap your fingers and create one, what would it be?
That might be to create a new privacy feature.
Or product.
So, I mean, I will go ahead. I mean, I suppose that the easy sort of slam dunk for me is the ability to sort of snap my fingers and disable, I mean, I would say all facial recognition around the world immediately. But in the least, giving people an automatic protection against facial recognition technology. So if it were as easy as, wearing a necklace that, protected you for all eternity against facial recognition technology, then that would be great because, but of course, because no one's an island, you would need everyone to be wearing it. Otherwise, people would be able to tell who you were because you were the one person that had the necklace that blocks facial recognition technology. So, nothing is bad.
Or a face shield, pun intended. I saw someone post something about such a recommendation about if only someone could invent a face shield that automatically blocks facial recognition technologies from scanning my face. That would be great. Maybe this code would work.
I mean, so I just went to existence, and then I'm going to talk it out of existence again because you basically, so what happens is you get into this never-ending game of cat and mouse, right? Where like one person invents the RFID blocker, and then someone invents the thing that defeats the RFID blocker, right? And I'd said elsewhere, I can't remember where, I said it's like a game of cat and mouse, and we always know that it never ends up well for the mouse, right? And so maybe what I would have is I'd snap my fingers and have a set of rules and regulations that would, correct the business incentives to less corrosive business models that don't savage our well-being in public institutions.
Yes, certainly. I mean, we've just been so used to monetizing data as a business model, and it has to change. And it's encouraging that there are companies out there that are trying to correct this and change the way we've built the internet as we know it today. But we'll see. It all depends on a lot of factors, on regulation, but also the technologists and also us as consumers, and whether we're going to pick those technologies over the creepier alternatives. And so we all have our role to play, I believe, and even the VCs and the founders do, which is why we, in this series anyway, we talked to some of the founders who are interested in trying to solve some of these problems from a tech perspective. I want to give you some time to maybe impart a closing message to our audience and tell them where they can find you or continue the conversation with you online if you so wish. And to thank you so much for your time today. It's been a lovely conversation. I always learn something from you and your work and reading your works and books. So thank you for joining us today, Professor Hartzog.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, I'm always happy to hear from people that have questions or want to learn, where to go for more reading or anything like that. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and keep asking the tough questions because I do remain optimistic, and I appreciate the opportunity to come on your show.
Thank you so much, and I'll send links. I'll include links to the book and some of the works that we were mentioning by Dan and Ari in the show notes that we publish. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day. Take care.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Bye.